Dear Danny Kahneman, sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, lassen Sie mich die Geschichte von Daniel Kahneman aus einer ungewöhnlichen Perspektive erzählen. Die Perspektive eines typischen Mainstream-Forschers in der Ökonomie. Nennen wir ihn Indagator Economicus. Die gesamte Forschung von Indagator Economicus basiert auf Axiomen, die den Menschen als Homo economicus beschreiben. Und zu diesen Axiomen gehören etwa die folgenden. Die Menschen sehen die Welt objektiv, machen keine vorhersehbaren Fehler und haben daher rationale Erwartungen. Ihre Annahmen basieren auf Wahrscheinlichkeiten, die wiederum auf objektiven Beobachtungen aus der Vergangenheit basieren. Ihre Präferenzen sind stabil, konsistent und unabhängig von dem, was sie besitzen. Menschen treffen Entscheidungen gemäß ihrer Präferenzen, maximieren damit ihr Wohlbefinden. Das habe ich gelernt als Ökonomiestudent. Das habe ich zu meiner Schande vielen Studenten beigebracht. Diese Axiome gelten als unfehlbar in unserer Zunft. Auf ihrer Basis werden ökonomische Ereignisse vorhergesagt, Politik gemacht. Nun, außerhalb der Wirtschaftswissenschaften untersuchen Forscher zur gleichen Zeit die eigentlichen mentalen Prozesse des Menschen, wie er eigentlich die Welt wahrnimmt, was ihn eigentlich motiviert. Und ein besonders prominenter Vertreter dieser Gattung ist der Psychologe Daniel Kahneman, der gemeinsam mit diversen Autoren, ganz besonders Amos Tversky, zeigt, dass die Grundannahmen der Ökonomie häufig falsch sind. Geboren wurde Daniel Kahneman im Jahre 1934 in Tel Aviv. Aufgewachsen ist er in Paris, wohin seine Eltern, litauische Juden, in den 20er Jahren ausgewandert waren. Nachdem sie die Schrecken der Nazizeit überstanden hatten, wanderte er mit seiner Mutter und Schwester nach Israel aus. Hier schlug er Wurzeln und entwickelte Interessen für psychologische Fragen. Nach dem Militärdienst konnte Kahneman dank eines Stipendiums ein PhD in Psychologie an der University of California in Berkeley machen. Und bevor er nach Princeton kam, war er an der Hebräischen Universität in Jerusalem, University of British Columbia und der UC Berkeley tätig. Daniel Kahnemans Forschung zeigt, dass Menschen bei ihren Entscheidungen systematische Fehler unterlaufen. Denn ihre Annahmen basieren auf beschränkt validen Daten, die nach heuristischen Regeln verarbeitet werden. So bewerten Menschen die Wahrscheinlichkeit eines bestimmten Ereignisses nach ähnlichen Entwicklungen, über die sie mehr wissen. Außerdem evaluieren sie die Wahrscheinlichkeit eines bestimmten Ereignisses danach, wie leicht sie sich an etwas Ähnlichem erinnern können. Ihre Präferenzen hängen von ihrem derzeitigen Besitzstand ab, relativ zu dem sie risikoavers in Bezug auf Gewinne und risikofreudig in Bezug auf Verluste sind. So ihre Präferenzen sind weder stabil noch konsistent, aber trotzdem vorhersehbar. Daniel Kahneman hat gezeigt, dass die Ziele, die menschlichen Entscheidungen zugrunde liegen, das ist ihr Entscheidungsnutzen, nicht identisch sind mit was ihnen am meisten gefällt, ihren erlebten Nutzen. Es gibt auch einen Unterschied zwischen dem Nutzen, den man durch ein Ereignis erfährt, den man von einem Ereignis erwartet und den man an sich anschließend erinnert. Das sind drei verschiedene Sachen. Und das sorgt für ein radikal neues Verständnis darüber, wie Menschen die Welt um sich herum wahrnehmen, wie sie Entscheidungen treffen, was sie zur Kooperation bewegt und was die Ziele der Wirtschaftspolitik sein sollen. Diese Einsichten haben große Implikationen für ökonomische Vorhersagen, Unternehmensstrategien, Geld- und Fiskalpolitik, Sozialpolitik und noch viel mehr. Aber unser Indagator Ökonomicus blieb lange Zeit unbeeindruckt. 40 Jahre war die ökonomische Standardtheorie, die wir an den Universitäten lehren, so gut wie unberührt von diesen Ideen. Und seit Danny Kahneman 2002 den Wirtschaftsnobelpreis verliehen bekommen hat, wurde es etwas schwieriger, ihn zu ignorieren. Erst heutzutage beginnt ein Bruchteil der bedeutenden ökonomischen Zeitschriften Veröffentlichungen zuzulassen, die nicht den Axiomen des Homo economicus treu sind. So, dear Danny, though you claim never to have attended a single economics course in your life, you have sent shockwaves through the economics profession. And we at the Kiel Institute of Economics are beginning to explore the implications of your work for global economic affairs. And I personally find it really exciting to live in an era where we are finally beginning to understand that economic decisions cannot be analyzed independently from the psychological processes which underlie them. Good for us, I say. It's a pleasure and honor for me to confer on you the Global Economy Prize in the field of economics. Thank you.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be here. It is an embarrassment to be following my two predecessors because they deal with global problems. And I have studied all my life something that looks much smaller. I've studied the individual agent and, the characteristics of individual agents. I'd like to speak briefly about the implications of the standard economic model of Homo economicus for policy, for the way that governments and institutions more generally should address individuals, try to influence them, or try to serve their needs. There are actually some quite pernicious implications of the Homo economicus model, because it suggests that people do not need protection, which in fact they do need. So in the Homo economicus problem, people do not need protection against the mistakes that they make, because it is assumed that they make no mistakes. And this, for example, these are problems that are much more acute in the United States than they're in Europe. But in the United States, the notion of social security is still contested. And it is contested, and the intellectual basis for contesting it is very closely linked to the assumption of rationality. Individual agents are supposed to be rational, and they're expected to be responsible for the consequences of their choices, and it is assumed that the choices they make are far better than the choices that any government could make for them. It's quite a powerful idea. And it is also wrong, I think. It is also assumed, if people are fully rational, they do not need protection against predatory companies. Individual consumers do not need protection. And the only protection that they need is law enforcement. But anything that is legal is acceptable, is legitimate. Again, I think this is truer in the United States, which is a much more individualistic culture than the culture in Europe. But the implications of that are that the kinds of contracts that people are asked to sign for mortgages and even for things as simple as getting an account on the internet, the contracts are impossible to read. They're impossible to understand. And there are many possibilities for companies to exploit individuals. And this is simply denied when you assume that people are rational. This problem doesn't arise. One of the effects of what is called behavior economics, which is in fact economics that is influenced by psychology, one of the effects has been to admit that people do need protection. And there is a book that was written by two close friends of mine, and if you haven't read it, I strongly advise you to do it. The book is called Nudge in English, and it was written by Richard Thaler, who is the guru of behavior economics. He's an economist at Chicago, and by Cass Sunstein, who is perhaps one of the important jurists in the United States, either the first or the second most important, and who, for the last 3.5 years, has been the chief of regulation in the Obama White House, and has really implemented the kind of program of searching to protect individuals, both from their own mistakes, by changing what is called choice architecture, the way that choices are presented to individuals, for example, in the context of saving or in the context of purchasing mortgages. There is now enforced by regulation in this context. There are rules that simplify those choices, that make it possible for people really to understand the consequences of their actions in ways that were completely impossible before. There is another interesting difference between Homo economicus and human beings. Richard Thaler speaks of two species. He calls one of the species econs and the other humans. And one of the interesting differences really has come to mind very vividly for me in the recent year, because I'm involved in some consulting activities together with Steve Levitt, who is very well known as the author of Freakonomics, an international bestseller. And we have been working together with some companies, actually with a large company in Germany that has many, many stores, many branches. And the question was how to provide incentives to workers. And an interesting debate erupted actually between Steve and me, because it was quite obvious to Steve that you should incentivize individual workers for their individual achievements. Well, it was equally obvious to me as a psychologist that you should actually incentivize teams of workers who should then police each other and share the benefits of their joint work and of their cooperative work. So the idea of cooperation is much easier to understand within a psychological context than it is within a purely economic context. There is another implication of the change, I think, of the move toward behavior economics, and it's very evident in the work of Nudge. And this is a change in the ideas of how you can change the behavior of people. This is a profound modification. The roots in psychology go back a long way. In the 1930s, Kurt Lewin, who started out in Germany and continued his career in the United States, and was probably the most important social psychologist of the 20th century, he introduced what was then and still is a very counterintuitive idea about how to cause people to change their behavior. And one notes that when people try to change other people's behavior, the first thing that comes to mind, there are three ways of doing it. There are promises, there are threats, and there are arguments. And promises, threats, and arguments speak very well to an economic man. But Kurt Lewin suggested a different idea. And the different idea was not to ask how we could get people to change their behavior, but to ask why do we need to change their behavior? Why aren't they doing what we want them to do already now? It's a profoundly different question. Instead of asking, what can I do to push them? You ask, what is restraining them? Why aren't they doing what we want to do? That leads to very different ways to think about change. You think about what are the reasons or what are the causes that prevent people from behaviors that we wish they would engage in. And you end up changing small aspects of the environment sometimes, and that changes people's behavior. And I was very impressed by Nathan Eagle's description of what he does. And what he does is clearly incentives. He provides incentives to agents, for example, to provide information. But the very striking thing is that he got to this idea of incentives by asking, why did those nurses in hospitals not report the blood levels when they were instructed to do it? And then he asked, this is the Levinian question. This is the correct psychological question. Why aren't they doing it? Well, it turns out they were not doing it because it was expensive for them personally to do what was required, which was to use their mobile phone to transmit messages about the state of blood supply in their hospital. The solution that was found, once you see that this is the reason they're not doing it, then the solution is to compensate them. And it's not the incentive that is added, maybe 1 penny a day, maybe 1 penny a call. But this is a small incentive. This is not at all the way that one would think of changing behavior on a massive scale within the context of standard economic conception. What we see here is actually, as a psychologist, I think it's psychologically very sophisticated. You start by asking, why not? And then you look at the possible ways of changing the environment, often the minimal way of changing the environment, which will make it easy for people to do what is required of them. And there are many such interventions. There is actually at 10 Downing Street, there is a unit called the Unit for Behavioral Insights, but informally its name is the Nudge Unit. And their task is to seek for interventions and policy interventions that are easy, inexpensive, and can modify people's behavior. I will give you just one example, which is one of my favorites. There is some level of tax cheating in most countries. I suppose that even in Germany there is some, although probably less than in many others. And it turns out that you can reduce tax cheating by changing the tax form. In most countries, certainly in the United States, people complete the tax form and then they sign at the bottom of the form when they have completed the tax form. Here is a change. You ask people to sign at the top of the form. That reduces cheating. It's been shown experimentally. It's quite a powerful manipulation. It costs absolutely nothing. By asking people to sign before they complete the form, you remind them of their integrity, you remind them of themselves. The signature is an implicit promise to say the truth, and it affects their behavior as they complete the form. This is the kind of interventions that we should be looking for, and this is the kind of interventions that more and more people are looking for. It is not global solutions, but it will be involved, I suspect, in global solutions. Thank you. What is required of them. And there are many such interventions. There is actually at 10 Downing Street, there is a unit called the Unit for Behavioral Insights, but informally its name is the Nudge Unit. And their task is to seek for interventions and policy interventions that are easy, inexpensive, and can modify people's behavior. I will give you just one example, which is one of my favorites. There is some level of tax cheating in most countries. I suppose that even in Germany there is some, although probably less than in many others. And it turns out that you can reduce tax cheating by changing the tax form. In most countries, certainly in the United States, people complete the tax form and then they sign at the bottom of the form when they have completed the tax form. Here is a change. You ask people to sign at the top of the form. That reduces cheating. It's been shown experimentally. It's quite a powerful manipulation. It costs absolutely nothing. By asking people to sign before they complete the form, you remind them of their integrity, you remind them of themselves. The signature is an implicit promise to say the truth, and it affects their behavior as they complete the form. These are the kind of interventions that we should be looking for, and these are the kind of interventions that more and more people are looking for. It is not global solutions, but it will be involved, I suspect, in global solutions. Thank you.